I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we think of each other. In today's episode, we'll be looking at what politics sounds like when it's not coming from the voices of politicians. And I'll be talking with Dr Sarah Weston from the University of Manchester about how she's been working with people to help them feel more confident about speaking up in public.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
There are times when people who are not politicians, who might not see themselves as being very political, are thrust into the political limelight because they have witnessed something that the rest of us need to hear about. I'm thinking of people like the survivors of the Hillsborough and Grenfell tragedies, ordinary women and men who find themselves at the centre of events that compel the rest of us to think in new ways about justice, democracy, and which voices really need to be heard.
What strikes me most is a lack of surprise in the report. I think we've known all along that it was not going to be a Poirot moment where a murderer would be revealed, and in fact all the suspects were carrying the knife. And we've waited 7 years for change, and it hasn't come. This report needs to be a catalyst for change. We need to make sure that these recommendations are enacted without delay, that the construction industry changes the way it behaves, thinks about the people it's building houses for, thinks about keeping them safe.
I remember those women who fought for equal pay in the 1970s. They didn't sound anything like politicians, and yet they were to instigate fundamental political changes. When they started to speak about equality in the workplace, they were told to stop being so excitable and leave matters like politics and industrial relations to the usual suspects. Many of those women had never spoken out in public before and were nervous about doing so. But when they found their voices, they realised that they had a lot to say.
We've got to fight the bill before it goes through. It's no good fighting it afterwards and saying, well, we should have done it before, really. Well, you've got to fight now. You've got to stop it before it goes through.
So how do people find their voices and create their own sound of politics? I think that the answer has something to do with the raw power of personal testimony. Unlike politicians who are typically speaking on behalf of others, witnesses speak for themselves. What they tell us carries the emotional energy of lived experience, which, unlike a policy brief or an ideological treatise, cannot be contained. Their words are formed by feelings that simply have to be released. We might not always like what personal witnesses tell us, but we know that it is them speaking. Their voices open up a different kind of political space, one in which the storyteller and the story become indistinguishable. And we find ourselves evaluating ideas in more truly human terms than conventional politics normally demands from us. For example, the first time I listened to Nelson Mandela speaking about the inhumanity of apartheid and his imprisonment by its racist regime, I was not simply called upon to dispassionately repudiate a political ideology, but to acknowledge its effects upon a specific human being. But many people with important stories to tell lack the confidence to do so. They worry that they won't be able to find the right words, strike the right tone, look the right part. They imagine all the worst humiliations that could follow on from getting it all terribly wrong. But democratic politics needs to hear those voices. We lose much more than we realise when we leave political expression to the highly confident, who always expect to be heard. I intend to devote some future episodes of this podcast to talking with guests about how we can expand and diversify the range of political voices we hear every day on the news, in the institutions that represent us, in the organisations that surround us locally, on podcasts for that matter. And I'm starting on that journey today by speaking with Dr Sarah Weston, who runs really effective workshops for young girls and women carers on how to make their voices heard. I want to hear her thoughts about what confident voice means and what obstacles stand in its way. Sarah, when you listen to people like the Grenfell survivors and the Hillsborough survivors, there's something compellingly authentic about their voices. What is it, do you think, that makes their voices so much more convincing than, say, the average politician?
I think that the temptation here would be to give a quite easy answer of politicians are inauthentic or liars or that kind of thing. I don't think that's quite right. My hunch of this would be it's more to do with hearing voices that we don't normally hear in the political conversation. And there's something quite moving, I think, about that. But I also think that there is something quite significant and important about when people speak to their own experience. I think that quite often when, a politician speaks, they might be trying to do something else with their voice other than just communicating the words that they're saying. They're trying to persuade someone or they're trying to kind of appeal to someone or something like that. But when people communicate their own experiences of injustice or trauma, they can't do anything but express that, I suppose. And then I think that's probably where the feeling of authenticity comes to, is the kind of deep connection between the words, the voice and experience, rather than using the voice to try and relay something else.
You've worked with a lot of people who are fairly fearful about speaking in public. I suppose most people are. What is it, do you think, that makes people scared of standing up in front of other people and letting their voices be heard?
So I think there's two things here. I think the first one is that the voice is very personal, and it's kind of deeply personal and deeply instructive of who we are. It's quite difficult to hide who you are through your voice, and kind of everything about you and your background and who you are and where you've come from quite often is clear through the voice. And the voice often kind of says things about us that maybe we want people to know or don't want to know about us, or alternatively, people hear things that may or may not be true about you in your voice as well. So, for instance, I've got a Liverpool accent, and I think that says a lot about me, and some of that might be true and some might not be true, but I kind of don't have control of that. So that's one side of it. But I also think rightly, that people are worried or nervous about speaking in public because so few of us have had any experience or training in how to do that. It's a skill that some people get and most of us don't, and it's not an easy thing to do, and actually it can take quite a lot of training to be good at it, and that's not something that people can just sort of easily overcome. I think there's actually kind of forms of training that can help people with that, and that kind of training's not very equally distributed.
Let's talk a little bit about what you call the training and the techniques. I suppose some of them are intuitive, speak up, remember to kind of remember what you're saying and so on. What are the kind of techniques, what's kind of advice that you would offer people in helping them to feel more confident about self-expression?
So I come from theatre background, and the kind of approach to voice that I do in communities when I'm working with community groups and things like that is a kind of actor training approach to voice and voice technique. And one of the main ways in which I might work with a community if we are approaching something like public speaking, or quite often people who I work with say they're afraid of public speaking and they want to get better at it. One of the main ways we might approach that or way in is to move away from kind of focusing on the act of public speaking and the kind of mental torment, I suppose, and fear that comes with that, and instead look to the voice as a physical process and think about approaching specific techniques or things that we do in our body and focus on that rather than focus on teaching someone to be good at public speaking. So we may, for instance, focus for a long period of time on breathing and how we breathe and how we ensure that we make the most, I suppose, of our breath capacity and breathing from the stomach and all these kind of things to do with breath and breath technique. A big part of it, I think, is encouraging relaxation and getting rid of tension in places that kind of support voice or the kind of around the vocal apparatus. So, getting rid of tension in the neck, shoulders, throat, these kind of places. And also because part of the problem, I think, why people are so scared of public speaking, and then when they do go to speak in public, it becomes such a horrible experience for people, is because nerves and fear and those kind of emotions actually do affect the voice, I suppose, because they kind of make those places I mentioned too tense, like you might tense your shoulders up in a situation where you feel relaxed. So if you put the focus on the physical processes of relaxing rather than just telling someone to feel relaxed or telling someone not to be nervous, I think that the physical can have the effect of helping people relax and help their voice be as strong as it can be. So yeah, I think, to give a short answer, it's kind of taking it back to the physical processes of voice and away from this kind of focus of being good or bad at speaking.
One of the things that I know you've worked on quite a lot and I found really impressive is vocal ensemble, where not through singing but through speaking, groups of people have used their voice. And there seems to be something we kind of hear less of in contemporary society. I suppose the best example I can think of is what happens at football matches, but that's rather an unusual situation. Could you tell us a little bit more about what speaking in unison can do, and perhaps particularly in a political context?
So I think, to come back to the point that you made about people being afraid of public speaking or nervous about it, what I think the ensemble or speaking with other people provides is a sense of support, network, a kind of community of voices where you speak together, and that can actually be very effective for people who might have something that they want to say but don't feel ready yet to say it on their own. And I've found in community workshops, for instance, working with young people, there might be a young person who has something they really want to say, but for whatever reason they don't want to say it on their own, and you can have an ensemble there to help people say it as a group. It gives it kind of physical support, as in it will obviously make it louder, but it also gives that person the sense or the ability to speak without kind of standing out or feeling alone when they speak. So there's that. But I also think that voicing together helps people kind of find a language in common or a voice in common, which I think is a really interesting thing. And a voice in common can also have this kind of effect of equalising the situation, I suppose, bringing people together by what they have in common and finding some kind of commonality together. So I found it, just a really useful way to kind of, I suppose, create community with groups you're working with, but also once that community is created through voicing together, that acts as a form of support to the other people in the group.
No, I think that's right. I think it's really intriguing and something that we don't talk about enough. I mean, after all, the Greek chorus was one of the central pillars of Athenian democracy. We often talk, don't we, about the need for certain groups in society to have a voice. What exactly do you think we mean by that? How can it be realised? What is it that we could actively be doing to go to groups of people whose voices have traditionally been, at worst, silenced, but otherwise marginalised, and say to them, this is how you have a voice?
Yeah, so I think in one sense, voice here is it's a kind of representational question, isn't it? That many voices don't feel heard in society, I suppose. And it's a matter of kind of like, how do we ensure that different voices are part of the conversation, whether that be it's around policy or whatever it might be. But I think as well as thinking about representation in that sense, we also have to think, to come back to a point that I made earlier, about how unequally distributed the knowledge and tools of voice are. Often, unless you kind of go to somewhere like a drama school or a private school or a university, you probably haven't ever really engaged in acts of public speaking and acts of representation, and you're probably not that equipped to do it. So I think that part of this intervention has to be kind of addressing the way in which vocal tools is badly redistributed, and that we can make an effort to also redistribute voice in a kind of thinking about voice production as well as this more representational idea of voice.
And I think, incidentally, what you're saying would apply to a lot of universities and students there who don't, unfortunately, ever get that opportunity. Sarah, I found it really interesting to speak to you with you about this, and I hope that we're going to have more guests talking about these particular questions of how we create an equality in the sound of politics, which will be one of the strands of this podcast in future weeks. The human voice is the most ancient and still the most ubiquitous medium of communication in existence. It is what we may call a low-level communication technology, one that is so widely available that we often don't know we're using it. It is the most primordial channel of mediation, working between the subjectivity of the self and the objectivity of what surrounds us, to generate forms of intelligibility. Our voices speak of our presence. They announce that we are here and have something to say. There is much talk about digital divides, how some social groups have more access, skills and control over their online presence than others. And that's right. But I want to draw attention to the vocal divide, how some voices, even before we know what they're going to say, are more likely to be listened to, more likely to be respected, quite simply more politically powerful than others. This divide is cultural, not natural, and I propose in future episodes to explore the nature of that cultural inequality and consider ways of levelling the political power to speak and be heard.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.